The Chicago Municipal Court buzzed with its usual morning activity, its corridors echoing with the sounds of hurried footsteps on polished floors. The air was filled with a mix of nervous whispers and the sharp clatter of papers being shuffled. People moved purposefully through security, adjusting their belongings and preparing for their appearances before the judge. It was 9:15 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning when Sarah Mitchell, an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, pushed open the large wooden doors of courtroom 302. Sarah hadn't planned to be in court today. Typically, her mornings were spent chasing leads for her next big story or typing away at her desk, immersed in the world of investigative journalism. But today was different. A parking ticket she'd received 3 weeks earlier had brought her to this crowded room. She wasn't particularly worried about the fine, it was more of an inconvenience than anything else. Dressed in simple blue jeans and a neat white blouse, Sarah had chosen comfortable clothes for what she thought would be a quick court appearance followed by a day of interviews. The courtroom was like countless others she'd seen in her years of reporting. Rows of worn wooden benches stretched toward the judge's elevated platform, where an American flag stood proudly in the corner. Sarah found a spot near the back, sliding into a bench as she pulled out her phone to check emails. Around her, people whispered nervously, their voices blending into a low hum, while others flipped through documents or rehearsed explanations they would soon present before the judge. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Robert Henderson entered the courtroom. A bailiff called out, "All rise," and the crowd stood in unison. Judge Henderson, a tall man in his early 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, took his seat with the kind of authority that only years on the bench could command. His reputation preceded him. He had been presiding over traffic court for 15 years and was known throughout Chicago for his strict demeanor and sharp tongue. As the session began, one by one, defendants stepped forward when their names were called. Sarah watched with a journalist's eye, her instincts quietly sharpening. She noticed how Judge Henderson handled each case, his tone and demeanor shifting depending on the person before him. To some, particularly white defendants, he offered patient explanations, his tone measured and even. But when it came to others, minorities, she noted, the judge's responses were curt, dismissive, and at times outright condescending. A pattern was forming, one Sarah couldn't ignore, even though she hadn't come here to work. Finally, her name was called. Sarah Mitchell, the clerk announced, and Sarah rose, walking to the podium with the citation in hand. She had prepared a simple explanation about the unclear parking signs that had led to her ticket, accompanied by a set of photos she had taken showing how overgrown tree branches obscured the signage. But before she could even begin to speak, Judge Henderson cut her off. "Another parking violation," he said, his voice carrying a tone of disapproval that filled the room. Heads turned toward Sarah, curious about what was unfolding. "I see this is your second ticket this year, Miss Mitchell?" "Yes, Your Honor, but if I could explain," Sarah began, keeping her tone polite. "The signs are perfectly clear," Judge Henderson interrupted, not even glancing up from the papers in front of him. His tone was sharp, dismissive, as though he had already decided her guilt. "This area has been a no-parking zone for 20 years. I don't understand why some people find it so difficult to follow simple rules." Sarah froze, stunned by the judge's tone. Just minutes earlier, she had watched him patiently listen to a white woman with a similar violation explain her circumstances. That woman had been allowed to show her evidence and left with a reduced fine. Yet here she was, being dismissed without so much as a glance. "Your Honor," Sarah tried again, holding up her photos, "I have evidence showing." "That will be $300, Judge Henderson interrupted, finally looking up at her, though his gaze was cold and impersonal. "Plus $50 in court costs. Next case." Sarah stood there, momentarily stunned. It wasn't the fine itself that bothered her, she could afford it, but the disparity in treatment. As she turned to gather her belongings, she overheard two court officers whispering near the side of the room. "Henderson's in a mood today," one said. "Yeah, but did you see how he treated that lady before?" the other replied. "Exact same violation. Completely different story." They hadn't realized Sarah could hear them, but their words confirmed what she had already suspected. Something wasn't right. Pulling out the small reporter's notebook she always carried, Sarah began jotting down details, the judge's tone, his words, and the reactions of those around her. What had started as a routine court appearance was quickly turning into something much bigger. By the time she walked down the courthouse steps, the crisp morning air did little to clear her thoughts. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her editor at the Chicago Tribune. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice tinged with urgency, "I think I've stumbled onto something." I need access to the court's public records. Judge Henderson's cases as far back as we can go. The next morning, Sarah was seated at her desk in the bustling Tribune office, surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop. Dozens of browser tabs were open on her screen, each one a court record from Judge Henderson's traffic cases. She had been there since 6 a.m., her coffee cup already refilled 3 times. This is interesting, she muttered to herself, her pen moving quickly across her notebook. Patterns were beginning to emerge and they painted a troubling picture. According to the records, Judge Henderson's fines for minority defendants were, on average, 45% higher than those imposed on white defendants for the same violations. Mark Thompson, her editor, approached her desk. A veteran journalist with 3 decades of experience, Mark had an eye for stories that mattered and a deep commitment to uncovering injustice. "What have you found?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her. Sarah turned her screen toward him, pointing to the spreadsheet she had been building. "Look at this," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. Last month alone, Henderson handled 200 cases involving similar parking violations. White defendants paid an average fine of $150. Black and Hispanic defendants, for the exact same offenses, paid an average of $275. Mark leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he studied the data. "Do you have more?" he asked, his tone serious. Sarah nodded, pulling up another set of records. "It's not just parking violations. Across the board, his sentencing patterns show clear disparities. I've found cases where minority defendants received higher fines and harsher judgments, even when their circumstances were identical to white defendants." Mark exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "This could be huge," he said. "But we'll need more than just numbers. Can you get interviews? Maybe people who've been through his courtroom?" Sarah nodded again, determination in her eyes. "I'm already working on it." By the time she turned back to her screen, the parking ticket that had brought her to court was all but forgotten. What had started as a routine inconvenience was now evolving into an investigation that could expose deep-seated inequities in Chicago's justice system. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most important stories begin when you least expect them. The Chicago Tribune office buzzed with energy, reporters darting between desks, and the hum of conversations filling the air. At her desk, Sarah Mitchell was engrossed in her research. Papers, notes, and court documents were scattered across her workspace, and her laptop displayed a dozen tabs open to public records and spreadsheets. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notebook, replaying clips on her phone from the previous day's courtroom session. Mark Thompson, her editor, leaned over her shoulder. "What have you got so far?" Sarah nodded toward her phone. "I recorded yesterday's entire session. It's legal in public courtrooms," she said, pressing play on one of the clips. "Listen to this." Mark listened intently as the judge's voice came through, his tone polite and measured as he addressed one defendant, then sharp and dismissive with another. Sarah let the recordings play for several minutes, showcasing the stark difference in how Judge Henderson treated different defendants. "It's all here," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You can hear it. He's patient with some but dismisses others, minorities specifically, without a second thought. And that's just one day." Mark crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. "One day might not be enough for the kind of story you're aiming for." "I know," Sarah replied, spreading out more documents across her desk. "That's why I went deeper. Linda from the courthouse archives helped me pull records from the past 5 years. The pattern isn't new, Mark. It's been happening for years. The differences in individual cases might seem small on the surface, but when you put them all together, it's impossible to ignore." Mark picked up one of the files, flipping through it thoughtfully. "You're onto something here," he said. Just then Sarah's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen, a text message from a court clerk who had seen her in the courtroom the day before. The message read, "Judge Henderson knows who you are now. He found out you're a reporter. He's not happy ****. Sarah frowned and showed the message to Mark. "Well, that complicates things," she said. "Or makes them more interesting," Mark replied with a faint smile. "How do you want to handle this?" Sarah thought for a moment, her pen tapping against her desk. "I need to talk to more people who've been through his courtroom," she said decisively. "Get their stories, their experiences. Numbers are good, but real people make the story powerful." She pulled up another document on her computer and pointed to a list. "I've already found 15 people willing to talk. All minorities. All received unusually harsh fines. One woman told me she lost her job because she couldn't pay the fine and couldn't afford to drive to work after her license was suspended." Mark nodded approvingly. "Be careful though," he warned. Henderson has friends in high places. I've heard he plays golf with the police chief every weekend. Sarah stood, grabbing her coat and shoulder bag. I'm meeting my first interview in an hour, a teacher who got fined $500 for a broken taillight. The same day, a white businessman paid $100 for the exact same violation. As she packed her bag, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Judge Henderson's office, requesting a meeting to discuss yesterday's misunderstanding. Sarah showed it to Mark. He's trying to control the damage, Mark said, raising an eyebrow. What are you going to do? I'll meet him, Sarah replied. But not yet. First, I need more evidence, more stories. He needs to know this isn't about my personal experience, it's about justice. Before leaving, Sarah made copies of all her documents. Years of investigative reporting had taught her to always have backups. One set went into the office safe and the other into her bag. As she walked to her car, Sarah thought about the people who had stood in that courtroom, feeling powerless as they faced unfair treatment. What had begun as a simple parking ticket had turned into something much bigger, a story about power, prejudice, and the urgent need for change in the justice system. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the court clerk read, Judge Henderson is making calls. Be careful ****. Sarah smiled slightly, undeterred. She had dealt with powerful people trying to stop her stories before, and it only made her more determined to uncover the truth. Her first interview of the day took place in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side. Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle school teacher, sat across from Sarah at her kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. Her eyes, tired but resolute, met Sarah's as she began to recount her experience. I paid $500 for a broken taillight, Mrs. Rodriguez said, sliding her court papers across the table. I'm a single mom teaching at Lincoln Elementary. That fine meant no new school supplies for my classroom that month. Sarah recorded the conversation, taking careful notes. And you saw someone else get a different fine that day? She asked gently. Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez replied firmly. A man in an expensive suit. Same violation. Judge Henderson was so polite to him, called him sir and everything. His fine was only $100. Sarah wrote it all down, her reporter's instinct kicking into high gear. As Mrs. Rodriguez spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message from the clerk read, Judge Henderson canceled all his cases for next week. He's meeting with lawyers ****. Sarah thanked Mrs. Rodriguez, collected copies of her documents, and headed to her next interview. By the time she arrived, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. Her final stop of the day was a small barbershop owned by Mr. James, a black businessman who had appeared in Judge Henderson's courtroom just last month. Inside the shop, which was now closed for the day, Mr. James was waiting with a folder of documents. I've been running this shop for 15 years, Mr. James said, sliding the folder toward Sarah. Never had any trouble until I got that parking ticket. Judge Henderson treated me like I was stupid. Wouldn't even let me explain that the parking meter was broken. Sarah flipped through the papers. $400 fine for an expired meter, she read aloud. That seems unusually high. The white lady before me, Mr. James said, shaking his head. Same thing, broken meter and all. She paid $125. Just then Sarah's phone rang. It was Mark. You need to see this, he said, urgency in his voice. Someone just sent us security camera footage from the courthouse parking lot. It shows Judge Henderson's car parked in a no parking zone yesterday. No ticket. Sarah's eyes widened. Can we verify it's real? Already did, Mark said. And there's more. We got an anonymous email with photos of Henderson at private dinners with real estate developers. These are the same developers whose parking violation cases he's ruled on, and they always seem to win. Sarah thanked Mr. James, gathered her things, and headed back to the Tribune office. The sun was setting as she walked through the parking lot, casting long shadows between the cars. A black SUV. Remain calm and focused. When she arrived at the office, Mark showed her the footage and the photos. His expression was serious. This is bigger than traffic court, he said. These developers are connected to some very powerful people in the city. Sarah nodded, her determination hardening. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a story about fines, it was a story about corruption, power, and a justice system that had been quietly failing the people it was supposed to serve. And Sarah wasn't about to stop now. The Chicago Tribune office was still waking up when Sarah Mitchell walked in, carrying 2 large cups of coffee and a folder stuffed with documents. She hadn't slept much the night before, but her adrenaline kept her moving. As she approached her desk, she noticed Mark Thompson, her editor, already seated with a grim expression, scrolling through emails. He looked up and gestured for her to sit. "We've got a problem," he said, sliding his laptop toward her. Sarah scanned the screen. It was an email from Judge Robert Henderson's private account, not his official one. The subject line read, "Meeting request, urgent. Dear Ms. Mitchell. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. I would like to meet privately to discuss your recent court appearance and clear things up. Perhaps over dinner? My treat. Sarah set the laptop down, her expression incredulous. "He's trying to buy me off," she said, shaking her head. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked, though the answer was already clear in his mind. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering her options for only a moment before she began typing a response. "Dear Judge Henderson. Thank you for your invitation. I would be happy to meet with you in my office at the Chicago Tribune, with my editor present. We have some questions about your sentencing patterns that we'd like to discuss. She hit send and looked up at Mark. "We need to go through every case he's handled in the last 5 years, every single one," she said, determination etched into her voice. The team got to work. Other journalists at the Tribune joined in, analyzing the growing mountain of data. As the hours passed, new evidence trickled in. Emails from former defendants poured into Sarah's inbox, many sharing stories of harsh fines and dismissive treatment. Each account fit the pattern she was uncovering. Judge Henderson's courtroom wasn't just biased, it was systematically discriminatory. Late in the evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from the courthouse clerk. Henderson just left an angry message for the chief judge. He said he won't let some reporter ruin his reputation. Be careful. Sarah smiled grimly, tapping her pen against the desk. Too late for that, she muttered before diving back into her work. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the office to an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby. A tall, well-dressed man in an expensive suit stood with a calm yet imposing air. He approached Sarah as she entered. "Ms. Mitchell, I presume," he said smoothly, extending a business card. "David Cooper. I represent Judge Henderson as his personal attorney. I believe we should talk about these allegations you're investigating." Sarah accepted the card but kept her face neutral. "Any statements from Judge Henderson should be made officially, through the Tribune's legal department," she replied, her voice calm. Mark appeared at her side just then, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Is there a problem here?" "Not at all," Cooper said with a practiced smile, though his tone carried an underlying threat. "Just delivering a friendly message. Judge Henderson is a respected member of the legal community. It would be unfortunate if false accusations were made public." When Cooper left, Mark and Sarah exchanged a look. "They're getting nervous," Mark said, studying the card Cooper had left behind. "That means we're on the right track." Sarah nodded and turned to her computer. "Look at this," she said, pulling up her email. 5 more people came forward overnight, all with similar stories. One email is from a former court clerk who worked with Henderson 3 years ago. She says she has recorded conversations and memos. Mark's eyebrows rose. "When can you meet her?" "Today," Sarah replied, already drafting an email. At noon, Sarah met the former clerk, Linda Martinez, at a busy public park. They sat on a bench, surrounded by the noise of joggers and dog walkers. Linda wore oversized sunglasses and kept her voice low as she spoke. "I kept everything," Linda said, handing Sarah a thick folder. "Memos, notes, even recordings. Henderson was careful, but he made mistakes. He thought nobody would ever check." Inside the folder were damning documents. Handwritten notes revealed how Judge Henderson had instructed clerks to schedule minority defendants at the end of the day, making them wait longer. There were also records of discrepancies in fines based on race and socioeconomic status. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Sarah asked gently. Linda looked down, her hands fidgeting. "I needed the job," she admitted. "But I started collecting evidence, hoping someone would investigate someday. When I saw your name mentioned at the courthouse, I knew it was time." Back at the office, Sarah and Mark pored over the new evidence. The recordings were crystal clear. Henderson's voice could be heard giving explicit instructions to treat minority defendants differently. It was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. Just as they began cataloging the materials, the office's computers suddenly shut down. Sarah's screen went black, followed by the hum of servers powering down. "Server crash," someone from IT announced moments later. "Looks like someone tried to hack our system." Sarah leaned back in her chair, unfazed. "Good thing we kept paper copies," she said, patting the locked filing cabinet behind her desk. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the teacher she had interviewed earlier. "Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice shaking. "Someone broke into my car last night. They went through all my papers, but I'd already given you the important ones." Similar calls came in throughout the afternoon. Mr. James, the barber, reported suspicious men watching his shop. Linda called to say her home had been randomly selected for a tax audit. "They're trying to scare our sources," Mark said grimly. Sarah stood, her expression resolute. "Then we need to move faster. Call the legal team. It's time to prepare the story for publication." As they worked into the night, more evidence continued to arrive. Anonymous tips from other judges painted a damning picture of Henderson's private behavior. Police officers quietly shared stories of being pressured to target certain neighborhoods for traffic stops. At 6 p.m., Sarah's phone buzzed with another email. This one was from Judge Henderson's office. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement. Name your price, ****. Sarah showed the email to Mark, who shook his head. "It's an attempt to buy your silence," he said firmly. "Write it. Write the story that needs to be told." Sarah nodded, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She took a deep breath and began typing the first line. "4 years, Chicago's traffic court has been a stage for one judge's unchecked biases and systemic discrimination. Today, the curtain rises on the truth. The investigation was no longer just about Judge Henderson. It was about power, corruption, and the people who had suffered in silence." With every word she wrote, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility, but also the thrill of justice finally coming to light. Expanded rewrite ***. The headline appeared boldly on Sarah Mitchell's computer screen. "Justice for Sale, Discrimination and Corruption in Chicago Traffic Court." Below it were 5,000 meticulously crafted words, each one checked and rechecked, supported by damning evidence. Outside her office window, the same black SUV was still parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding whoever had been watching her for weeks. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was her shield, and now she had more than enough of it to expose the truth about Judge Robert Henderson. The Chicago Tribune office was unusually quiet that early Wednesday morning, the tension palpable. Sarah sat at her desk, sipping cold coffee and scanning her story for what felt like the 100th time. After 3 weeks of relentless investigation, the moment had finally arrived. Every detail had been verified: testimony from victims, statistical analyses, financial records, and most damning of all, the recordings from Linda Martinez, the former court clerk. The truth was undeniable. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, standing beside her desk with a fresh cup of coffee in hand. Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the headline. "Once we publish this, there's no going back." Just as she spoke, her phone rang. The screen displayed an unknown number, but Sarah answered anyway, putting the call on speaker. "Miss Mitchell," a deep voice said. "This is Chief Judge Wilson. Before you publish anything, I think we should meet. Judge Henderson has agreed to reduce your fine to 0. Mark raised an eyebrow and Sarah smirked, already unimpressed. "Chief Judge Wilson," she replied evenly, "this story isn't about my fine anymore. It's about hundreds of people who were treated unfairly in your courts." "You don't understand," Wilson interrupted, his tone hardening. "This story could damage the public's trust in our entire legal system." "Maybe that trust needs to be damaged," Sarah said firmly. "Maybe it needs to be rebuilt, on truth and fairness." After she hung up, she turned to Mark. "They're scared?" Mark nodded. "They should be. We have everything: proof of Henderson taking bribes, the recordings from Linda showing he gave discriminatory orders, and the statistical analysis that proves his bias." As if on cue, Sarah's computer dinged with a new email. The subject line read, "My side of the story." It was from Judge Henderson himself. The email was a rambling defense. Henderson claimed the discrepancies in fines were based on defendants' ability to pay. He insisted his meetings with real estate developers weren't harmless social gatherings, and suggested Sarah was only targeting him out of resentment over her parking ticket. "Should we include his response?" Sarah asked, leaning back in her chair. "Yes," Mark replied after a moment's thought. "Let readers see how he tries to justify it. It'll make our evidence even stronger." At 10 a.m., the office received another visit, this time from representatives of the State Judicial Ethics Committee. Rumors about the Tribune's investigation had reached their ears, and they wanted to see the evidence. Sarah walked them through everything. She showed them the statistics demonstrating how minorities paid an average of 45% more in fines. She played Linda's recordings of Henderson instructing staff to treat minority defendants differently. She laid out the financial records linking Henderson to developers who had received suspiciously favorable rulings in his court. "This is very serious," one committee member said, scribbling notes. "We'll need all copies of this evidence." "They're already safely stored in multiple locations," Sarah replied, her tone steely. Years of investigative journalism had taught her to always be prepared for retaliation. Just before noon, Judge Henderson made one last desperate attempt to stop the story. His lawyer arrived at the Tribune office, carrying a typed statement and a check. "The judge admits he may have shown poor judgment in some cases," the lawyer said smoothly. "He's willing to make a generous donation to any charity of Miss Mitchell's choice." Sarah didn't even glance at the check. "The story runs in 1 hour," she said firmly. At exactly 1 p.m., Sarah clicked publish. Within minutes, the story was live on the Tribune's website, and the fallout was immediate. Her phone buzzed with calls from other newspapers, TV stations, and radio shows. The evidence was clear and irrefutable. Over 1,000 cases of racial discrimination and fines, audio recordings of Henderson's orders, financial documents linking him to shady deals, and testimonies from dozens of victims of his unfair practices. By 2 p.m. the story had gone viral. Social media erupted as people shared their own experiences in Henderson's courtroom. Tweets with the hashtag #JusticeForChicago trended nationwide. Other news outlets picked up the story, crediting the Tribune's investigation. Sarah watched the chaos unfold, thinking of the people who had trusted her with their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, Linda Martinez, and so many others, they had been the backbone of this story. Their courage had made it possible to expose the truth. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from the courthouse clerk who had first tipped her off. "Judge Henderson just walked out of the courthouse. He's been asked to take a leave of absence pending an investigation." "You did it?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice and fairness in the city. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Tribune office to find it buzzing with activity. TV news vans lined the street outside, and her email inbox was flooded with over 1,000 new messages. "You need to see this." Mark called her over to the break room where the morning news played on TV. On the screen, Judge Henderson stood on the courthouse steps, holding a press conference. "These allegations are completely false," he said, his face red with anger. "This reporter has a personal vendetta because of a simple traffic fine. I have served this community for 20 years with honor." Sarah watched quietly, taking notes. Just then her phone rang. It was Linda Martinez, her voice trembling with worry. "They're trying to say I made up those recordings," Linda said. "2 men came to my house last night, claiming to be from the judge's office. They wanted me to sign a statement saying the recordings were fake." "Don't sign anything," Sarah told her firmly. "We've had those recordings verified by 3 different audio experts. The truth is on our side." As the day went on, more people came forward. Calls and emails flooded in from individuals who had suffered under Henderson's rulings. Other court staff began to leak additional evidence of his unethical behavior. By the afternoon, it was clear the story wasn't going away. For Sarah, the satisfaction of seeing the truth come to light was tempered by the understanding that her work was far from over. The city had to reckon with the corruption in its justice system, and change wouldn't happen overnight. But for now she had done what she had set out to do. The truth was out and there was no turning back. Expanded rewrite asterisk. In the days following the explosive revelations about Judge Robert Henderson's corruption, the investigation continued to gather momentum. A young intern from the courthouse sent Sarah Mitchell an email with screenshots of deleted emails, showing Henderson's instructions about adjusting fine amounts for different racial groups. The intern's courage to step forward was just one example of how cracks were beginning to form in the once impenetrable system. Along with that, Sarah received an anonymous tip from a parking enforcement officer who had sent photos of tickets that had been mysteriously canceled for the judge's friends. These pieces of evidence added to the growing web of corruption that was being exposed, and the story was taking on a life of its own. At noon, the State Judicial Ethics Committee issued its first public statement in response to the unfolding scandal. The committee acknowledged the serious nature of the allegations and the substantial evidence supporting them. Judge Robert Henderson, the statement declared, had been suspended from his duties pending a full investigation. This official statement was a clear victory for Sarah and the Tribune's investigation, but the work was far from over. Sarah's phone was ringing constantly, the sound almost relentless. News organizations from all over the country were calling for interviews. CNN wanted her to sit down for a primetime interview, while the New York Times asked for permission to run a follow-up story. Local radio stations were eager to hear about the investigation from the reporter who had broken the story wide open. "You should do some interviews," Mark suggested, his voice steady as he watched Sarah field the calls. "People need to hear from the person who uncovered all this." But Sarah, as always, kept her focus on the bigger picture. "The story isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about the people Henderson hurt. Let them tell their stories. They're the ones who matter." And so she arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, and several other victims of Henderson's discrimination to speak with the media. Their stories were raw, heartfelt, and powerful. These were not just numbers on a page or legal terms to be debated. They were real people, living with the consequences of a broken system. Their stories would drive home the human cost of judicial bias, and Sarah knew that their voices needed to be heard. By late afternoon, developments were coming fast. The FBI made a public announcement that they were opening an investigation into Henderson's connections with real estate developers. It was clear that Henderson's corruption had extended far beyond the courtroom and into the world of business and politics. 3 other judges who had worked closely with Henderson, including some of his most trusted allies, suddenly announced their early retirement. The timing of these retirements raised questions about just how much they knew, and how deep the rot ran within the system. Civil rights organizations, recognizing the widespread nature of the corruption, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of minorities who had been unfairly fined and mistreated in Henderson's court. The city council quickly responded by calling for a full review of all traffic court procedures. The ripple effects of Sarah's investigation were being felt across every level of government and society. At 4 p.m., Sarah received an unexpected visit. An elderly black woman walked into the Tribune's office, carrying a shoe box. She introduced herself as Mrs. Parker, and she had something to show Sarah. "I've been keeping these for 30 years, Mrs. Parker said, her voice soft but steady as she placed the box on Sarah's desk. "My husband used to say something wasn't right, but nobody would listen back then." Inside the box were hundreds of traffic court receipts from the 1990s, old, yellowed papers that had been carefully preserved over the years. Sarah examined the receipts, one by one, her heart sinking as she saw the same patterns of racial discrimination that had been exposed in her investigation. The fines were different for people of different races, with minorities consistently being charged higher amounts for the same violations. As Sarah sifted through the receipts, a realization dawned on her. This wasn't just about Henderson. The entire system was corrupt. The discrimination wasn't limited to a single judge or a single courthouse. It was a systemic issue that had persisted for decades. It was bigger than she had ever imagined, and now she had the proof. By evening, protests had erupted outside the courthouse. People from all walks of life were marching, chanting, and holding signs that read, "Justice should be colorblind and equal fines for equal violations." The crowd was diverse, with Black, Latino, white, and Asian individuals all united in their demand for change. It was a powerful display of solidarity, a sign that the fight for justice was no longer limited to the people who had been wronged by Henderson alone. From her office window, Sarah watched the protests unfold. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the court clerk who had initially tipped her off. "Other clerks are coming forward now. Some judges are nervous," the message read. "This is bigger than anyone thought." Mark walked over to her desk, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The FBI wants all our evidence," he said, his tone serious. "And the state Supreme Court just announced they're launching a wider investigation into racial bias in all Illinois traffic courts. They want you to testify next month?" Sarah nodded, thinking about how a simple parking ticket had set this all in motion. What had started as an investigation into one judge's misconduct had now morphed into an investigation into an entire system of corruption and racial discrimination. The work had only just begun. Later that day, as Sarah sat back at her desk, she was flooded with new information. Linda Martinez had sent her more recordings, this time of private meetings between Henderson and other judges where they discussed their fine adjustment system. The tapes were damning, revealing that Henderson wasn't working alone. He had been part of a larger network of judges who had been manipulating fines and cases to benefit the wealthy and punish those they deemed less worthy. Mrs. Rodriguez called with an update from her school. "The parents have started a legal fund," she explained. "They're helping everyone who was unfairly fined to file for refunds. Even the school board is supporting us." Mr. James, the barber shop owner, reported that business was booming. "People come in just to talk about the story," he said. "Everyone has their own Henderson story to share. We're not afraid anymore." In the afternoon, Sarah received an anonymous tip that would prove to be pivotal. Someone had sent a security camera footage to the Tribune, showing Judge Henderson meeting late at night with property developers in empty parking lots. The footage showed him accepting envelopes full of cash and shaking hands with developers who had received favorable rulings in his court. The dates and times on the footage matched perfectly with the dates of cases where developers had their violations mysteriously dismissed. "Look at this," Sarah said, calling Mark over to her desk. As he watched the footage, his eyes widened. "This is it," he said. "This is the smoking gun." Just as Sarah was processing this new information, her phone rang. The number was unlisted, and when she answered, a shaky voice spoke. "Miss Mitchell," the voice said. "I'm Judge Henderson's former secretary. There's something you need to see. Can we meet?" Sarah arranged to meet Mary Wilson, the former secretary, at a quiet cafe. When Mary arrived, she was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she passed Sarah a small USB drive. "I kept backups of everything," Mary whispered. "Emails, calendar entries, private notes." He never thought his secretary would turn against him. As Sarah examined the files on the drive, her eyes widened. There were years of records, spreadsheets tracking fine amounts by race, notes about which developers needed special treatment, and lists of judges who were part of the scheme. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Henderson had been running a covert, organized system of discrimination and corruption, and now she had the evidence to prove it. When Sarah returned to the office, she found the protests outside the courthouse still ongoing, but there was a new energy to them. The chief judge had just announced that a complete review of all traffic court procedures was underway. The system was already starting to change. Sarah knew, however, that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. The real work of dismantling the corrupt system and building a more just and equal society had only just begun. But Sarah was ready for it. She was more determined than ever to follow the truth wherever it led. Expanded rewrite asterisk. The overhaul of the traffic court system had begun, and the changes were monumental. New rules would require regular audits of fine amounts to ensure fairness, mandatory bias training for all judges, and public reporting of fine statistics by race and income. These measures were just the start of a larger movement to ensure that such a gross miscarriage of justice would never happen again. When Sarah saw the announcement, Mark stood beside her with a proud smile. "You did this," Mark said, his voice full of admiration as he pointed to the official statement on his computer. Sarah gazed at the screen, seeing her work come to fruition. But while the reforms were significant, her mind was already moving ahead to the next phase. The evidence from Mary, combined with the FBI's ongoing investigation, pointed to a network of corruption that extended beyond Chicago's borders. This wasn't just about one city's traffic court system anymore. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah told Mark as she read over the latest updates. "This is about how justice works, or doesn't work, for people across the entire country." She knew this was no longer just a local story, it had become a nationwide issue. It was a question of fairness and equality in the judicial system at every level. Late that evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave the office, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Judge Henderson's clerk. The message was short and to the point. Asterisk, he's gone. Cleaned out his office tonight. Left for his lake house in Michigan. FBI is following him. Asterisk. Sarah read the message quietly. The thought that Henderson had fled was unsurprising. She had expected it. The truth had come out, and now he was trying to escape the consequences. But what Henderson didn't realize was that he could run, but the truth was already out. His system of corruption and discrimination was crumbling, piece by piece. As she packed up her notes, Sarah thought about the long journey she had been on since that fateful day when she first received her unfair parking ticket. She thought about all the people who had trusted her with their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, Linda, Mary, and countless others. Their courage had helped expose not just one corrupt judge but an entire system that needed to change. Each of them had made a difference, each in their own way. It was a reminder that sometimes, the biggest stories start with the smallest moments. Her parking ticket had been unjust, of course, but it had sparked a chain of events that had changed the course of history. That one small injustice had led to something much bigger. A chance to make the system a little more just for everyone. 3 months after Sarah's first article was published, she stood in the back of a packed courtroom, but this time it wasn't traffic court. It was the federal courthouse. And now it was Judge Henderson who was facing judgment. Sarah stood near the door, taking notes on a legal pad, with Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. James, and several other victims of Henderson's discrimination by her side. They had all come to see justice finally being served. Henderson, stripped of his robes and authority, appeared much smaller than he had when he had held power in the courtroom. His face was pale as the federal prosecutor read off the charges: corruption, discrimination, accepting bribes, and obstruction of justice. "How does the defendant plead?" the federal judge asked, his voice steady and authoritative. "Guilty, Your Honor," Henderson replied quietly, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. The words felt like the final nail in his coffin. The man who had once wielded so much power was now broken, standing in front of the very justice he had manipulated for years. Sarah observed the proceedings in silence, her pen moving rapidly as she documented the events. The significance of this moment wasn't lost on her. Henderson's guilty plea was a landmark, but the real victory lay in the many victims who had come forward to see justice done. Their courage had fueled the investigation, and now they were witnessing the fruits of their labor. Their stories had been heard, and the system was finally beginning to pay the price for its failures. After the hearing, Sarah walked back to the Tribune office with Mark, the spring air fresh and crisp as though it symbolized a new beginning. It was a turning point not just for the city of Chicago but for the entire country. The story that Sarah had started had become a movement, and it was clear that real change was happening. "You've got some visitors," the receptionist greeted Sarah with a smile when they arrived at the Tribune office. In the conference room, Sarah found Linda Martinez, Mary Wilson, and several other whistleblowers who had helped expose the truth. They had brought a cake with "thank you" written on it, a gesture of appreciation that warmed Sarah's heart. Linda, her voice full of excitement, couldn't wait to tell Sarah the latest news. "We heard about the journalism award," Linda said, hugging Sarah tightly. Sarah raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure what Linda meant. "The Pulitzer Committee announced their decision yesterday," Linda said, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Your investigation won for public service journalism." Sarah stood there for a moment, surprised by the news, but the joy quickly faded as her thoughts returned to the bigger picture. The award was nice, of course, but the real reward was in the changes that were happening across the justice system. In the 3 months since her first article was published, over 100,000 old traffic cases had been reviewed by the state. More than $15 million in unfair fines had been refunded to victims, many of whom had suffered for years because of a broken system. New anti-discrimination rules were being implemented in courts statewide, and the FBI's investigation had expanded to include other states. 5 other corrupt judges had resigned or been removed from their positions. The ripple effect of Sarah's work had created real, lasting change. Sarah's phone buzzed again and she glanced down at the screen. It was an email from Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman who had kept receipts for over 30 years. "Your story gave people hope," Mrs. Parker had written. "Now they know someone will listen when they speak up." Later that afternoon, Sarah visited Mr. James's barbershop. It was a busy afternoon, and she noticed that a framed copy of her first article hung proudly on the wall. The place felt alive, vibrant with conversation and laughter. "Business is good," Mr. James said proudly as he noticed Sarah's gaze. "People say they trust me because I helped expose the truth. I even got some new customers from the suburbs." As Sarah walked back to her car, she passed the courthouse where it had all started. The protests were gone now, but new signs had replaced them, announcing the reforms that had been implemented. Equal justice under law and new traffic court guidelines in effect were emblazoned across the front. The system was changing. Her phone rang again. It was the state Supreme Court Chief Justice. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone respectful. "The Judicial Reform Committee has finished its work. Would you be willing to write about the changes we're implementing?" Sarah stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The work wasn't over, but it was a new chapter in the fight for justice. The public trust in the system had been shaken, but it was slowly being rebuilt. Sarah agreed to write the piece, knowing that it was another step toward a more just and equitable system. Back at her desk, Sarah looked at the small frame Mark had given her. Inside was her original parking ticket, the one that had started it all. Beside it was a quote she had written: "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest injustices." "Ready for your next story?" Mark asked, dropping a new file on her desk. "We've got tips about similar problems in housing courts." Sarah smiled, opened her laptop and got to work. One story had ended, but the work of protecting justice was never really finished. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave, she received one final text from the court clerk who had first helped her. "Just heard Henderson is going to serve 5 years. The other judges are pleading guilty too." "You really did it?" Sarah looked out the window of her office, gazing at the city lights. Chicago wasn't perfect, but it was a little more just today than it had been 3 months ago, all because one reporter had gotten an unfair parking ticket and decided to ask questions. Sometimes she thought that's all it takes. one person willing to stand up and expose the truth. The rest, as her story had shown, was history.